Okay, so here's the second of our two seminars today. This one is from Julien Froustey, who's from the Institute for Astrophysics in Paris. So Julien is a PhD student there in Paris. But before he was a PhD student, he did his master's and undergraduate at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris as well. So thank you, Julien, for being with us, and why don't you take it away?
Okay. Thank you. So first, let me thank you for giving me this opportunity. I'm going to present today the work I've been doing with my PhD supervisor, Cyril Pitrou, at the Institut d'Astrophysique de Paris, and more particularly on the primordial neutrino asymmetry evolution in the early universe. So when I'm talking about early universe, I like to show this usual plot of the expansion of the universe. And just to make things very clear, I'm going to discuss the first seconds, the first hundreds of seconds after the Big Bang, what is also called the mega-electron volt age, because the temperature of the universe was about 1 mega-electron volt. And this is the period just before Big Bang nucleosynthesis. So the question is, what is the universe content at that moment in the history of the universe? So you will have first an electromagnetic plasma with traces of muons and anti-muons, electrons and positrons and photons, which are coupled to neutrinos and antineutrinos through weak interactions. And I'm talking about traces of muons and anti-muons because we are in a temperature that is between the muon-anti-muon annihilation temperature, that is when the temperature reaches their mass, because then below this temperature, this reaction pair creation, pair annihilation is really displaced towards the annihilation side. And we are above, I mean, at least at the beginning, we are above the temperature of the electron-positron annihilation temperature, that is 0.5 mega-electron volt. And a key physical phenomenon taking place in that stage is the neutrino decoupling when the temperature is about 1 mega-electron volt, because the weak interactions become too weak compared to the Hubble rate. So neutrinos and antineutrinos decouple from the electromagnetic plasma, but actually they only partially, I mean, the decoupling process is not an instantaneous one. So it means that, for instance, the entropy released by these annihilations will be partly shared with neutrinos, and this is what gives rise to the effective number of neutrinos and distorted neutrino spectra. And this precise study of incomplete neutrino decoupling and the relic neutrino spectra is really important in precision cosmology today, because these spectra have multiple effects on the CMB, on BBN, because they set the expansion rate of the universe, because they affect the neutron-to-proton ratio. So we aim at studying and computing these spectra as precisely as possible. And so that's why today I'm going to talk about one aspect is the primordial asymmetries. Concerning the leptons, the remaining asymmetries are expected to be negligible because due to charge neutrality, they should be of the order of the baryon-to-photon ratio, and this is 10 to the minus 9, so we can safely neglect it. However, for neutrinos, there is no such bound, and I took one of the most recent bounds given BBN and CMB experiments. And so if you call Xi the degeneracy parameter, that is the ratio between the chemical potential and the temperature, you expect it to be, it can be of order 10 to the minus 2. And so that's why we are going to explore in this talk, I'm going to explore a range of degeneracies that will go from 10 to the minus 3 to 10 to the minus 1. And so the goal would be to study how those distribution functions of neutrinos evolve and what happens to them and what happens in particular to the degeneracies along the evolution. But one thing we need to keep in mind when we study neutrinos is the fact that in the standard model, there are 3 species of massless neutrinos, the 3 active species, nu e, nu mu, nu tau. But we've known for quite some time now, especially with the solar neutrino problem, that, I mean, now the standard, what I would call the new standard model for neutrinos, consider 3 mass states, which differ from the flavor states and which are mixed with each other through the PMNS mixing matrix. And this gives rise to the well-known phenomenon of neutrino oscillations. If you start with an electronic neutrino and you leave it to propagate in vacuum and you measure its flavor content at some later point, then you will have a superposition of flavor states. So an electronic neutrino transforms into the other flavors. And this has one very important consequence for the study we want to carry out, is the fact that we cannot describe the neutrino ensemble with just 3 distribution functions. Due to mixing, we have to promote this set of functions to a full density matrix with the diagonal components that would be the generalization of the occupation numbers, and the off-diagonal components which account for flavor coherence due to the mixing. And so the question is, how does this object evolve? And so we are looking at a generalization of the Boltzmann equation that we would have written for the distribution functions. And there have been different works in the past to derive this equation. I'm not going to talk about that now. But anyway, we end up on this main equation, that is the quantum kinetic equation, which gives, sorry, the time derivative of the density matrix for a given momentum. You can recognize here the time derivative taking into account the universe expansion. And on the right-hand side, you have different terms. First, the vacuum term, that is the term that would be, if it was alone, responsible for the well-known oscillations in vacuum. It's related to the mass square differences. So that's the standard oscillation experiments, what is expected for oscillation experiments. Then, due to the fact that neutrinos do not propagate in vacuum, but in a bath of leptons, there is a lepton mean field, an effective potential that takes that matrix form. It's related to the energy and pressure density of electrons and positrons, and muons and anti-muons. And then a term that will be crucial today is the self-interaction term. So same as for the lepton mean field, but due to the fact that there are neutrinos and anti-neutrinos, and due to the possible asymmetry between them, this gives rise to a potential. And finally, the collision term, which accounts for the different scattering and annihilation processes with charged leptons or self-interaction processes. And this is the most computationally expensive term, because of you have to do a phase space integral that is much more computationally expensive. In the following, in order to do a numerical resolution, you need to use some variables that are more adapted, first, which are dimensionless, and then which take into account the expansion of the universe. That's why I will use this X variable, which will be a proxy for the scale factor. And this Y variable, which will be a dimensionless momentum. And the co-moving temperature will be, if you want, like the common temperature of everyone, it's a temperature that goes as A-1. So it's a good reference temperature. So the quantum kinetic equation can be rewritten like that. And I put you have the H0 contribution for the vacuum, H-lep for the lepton mean field, J will be the self-interaction mean field, and so on. So we'd like to solve this equation, but first let me go to a 2-flavor system to really show how we can try to understand more physically what is happening. So a 2-flavor system, and just to make things very clear, we'll take the example of the nu mu nu tau mixing with these mixing parameters. And the 2-flavor system is particularly convenient because there is a possible vector representation of the matrix. Because if you expand the density matrix on the basis of Pauli sigma or the Pauli density matrices, then you can rewrite rho as a vector, rho x, rho y, rho z. And for instance, the z component gives you the difference between the mu and tau occupation numbers. So this will be very important in following. And if you use this vector representation for all the objects in your quantum kinetic equations, you can rewrite them in that way. So note that the commutators that were here for the mean field terms became cross products. And I didn't write up till now the equation for the anti-neutrino density matrix, but you can note it's quite the same, except that there is a minus sign in front of the lepton mean field plus vacuum contribution. I recall that V is H0 plus H lepton. So it's all the Hamiltonian without the self-interactions. And then the asymmetry vector, that is basically J, but with the prefactor that is different. We can write its evolution equation just by taking a difference of these two equations. And this will be actually convenient because this gives us the integrated asymmetry over all momenta between neutrinos and antineutrinos. So this is for the set of equations we would like to solve, basically, in a two-neutrino system. And the thing is, you can see that these equations have become precession equations. Rho, for instance, would, if we discard the collision term, it's basically, its goal is to precess around V plus J. So it will precess at a frequency given by V plus J. So now we have to look at what is precisely inside this V plus J. So on this plot, you have the orders of magnitudes of the different terms in the Hamiltonian. So in these solid lines, or the vacuum terms for the two mass squared differences, in dashed line, you have the mean field term, in green, the muon mean field, and in blue, the electron mean field. And on light blue, you have the self-potential for an average degeneracy. And so what we can see first is that these values will be very, very high compared to any other time scale, any other natural time scale in the problem. For instance, the collision rate is much, much smaller than any typical frequency. And if we looked at the typical variation of the vacuum term, mean field term, also this frequency is very small compared to the oscillation frequencies. And so this will lead us to an approximation that will be at the same time an approximation allowing us to reduce the computation time and also to really understand the physics. So this is what I will call the adiabatic transfer of averaged oscillation approximation. So as I said, the Hamiltonian components, they set the oscillation frequencies of the system. That's just a property of what is in the Hamiltonian. So if, to simplify, I just take this equation in general with a Hamiltonian H. We expect, as I said, a precession of rho around H. And if this precession is really fast compared to all the other timescales in the problem, basically any physical process will average out this fast transverse precession, and it amounts to projecting rho onto H. And then, if the Hamiltonian evolves slowly compared to this precession frequency, we can effectively describe the system as rho being at all times projected onto H and H slowly evolving. This slow evolution is in other words, a condition for adiabatic evolution. So it means this is the reason why I talk about adiabatic transfer of averaged oscillations. And this approximation, we've used it in our previous paper in the zero asymmetry case. So the Hamiltonian was just vacuum plus lepton mean field. And it was completely validated in the sense that we solved the problem of neutrino decoupling and computing the effective number of neutrinos, solving the full quantum kinetic equation and solving with the ATAO approximation, and the results were exactly the same. So let me go back to that plot just to discuss now more precisely what is inside the Hamiltonian. We see that since we need to look at what will be dominating in the Hamiltonian. If we discard for now the self-potential, we see that there will be some MSW transitions when we will go from when the temperature decreases from left to right, we will go from a lepton domination to a vacuum domination. First, here at about 10 megaelectron volt, that will be what I will call a muon-driven transition because it's due to the muon mean field. And then there will be two electron-driven transitions. This is for the Hamiltonian without the self-interactions, but you can see that if we take into account the self-interactions, we expect them to dominate along the evolution, at least until quite small temperatures. So now let's look at some results. First, in this plot, you will have I will plot two quantities, four quantities. In solid lines, it will be the neutrino density matrices. In dashed line, the anti-neutrino density matrices. And this is for two momenta, a small momentum in pink and a strong high momentum in blue. And to be clear, at high temperatures, all the momenta will be aligned on, and I will take no self-interaction for now, just to show you what happens if we don't put the self-interactions. So at high temperatures, all the vectors will be aligned with H lepton, and you can see here that it's aligned with the z-axis. But at smaller temperatures, so after the MSW transition, the vector H0, that will be the dominant contribution in the Hamiltonian, has a next component that is non-zero. So you see that first there is the pink transition, then the blue transition, and this is due to the fact that the MSW transition do not take place at the same time, since there is a wide dependence of the Hamiltonians. However, in the end, all vectors are aligned with the same direction that is given by this sine 2 theta minus cos 2 theta. But you see that every momentum mode evolves individually. There is no collective behavior at all. But if we now put the self-interaction mean field, you will see that the behavior, so I added J here, the behavior is really different. Now you can see first that the pink and blue modes stay locked together, and then there is this not at all an alignment with the Hamiltonian I was talking about before, but just a collective nonlinear effect of collective oscillations which accelerate with time. And this phenomenon that we will now try to explain has been called in the past synchronous oscillations. So let's talk about that now. So first, let me mention that this is a phenomenon that was uncovered and really well understood in the 2000s. For instance, the last two papers provided analytical treatments of the synchronous oscillations, but I want to revisit this here with the ATAO approximation, and then I will show you that we can go further thanks to this approximation. Just the main argument is that at high temperatures, the Hamiltonian is really dominated by the self-interactions. Remember in the plot I showed, the light blue curve was really above any other else. So it means that the vectors, the density matrix vectors, are really aligned with the asymmetry unit. This is the hat will mean a unit vector, and the norm of those vectors are given by, this is just at high temperatures, you have equilibrium distributions for the density matrices, so this is the norm. And so if you put these expressions into the evolution equation for A, you get this, you end up on this expression, which is quite interesting. You have a precession equation for the asymmetry vector. So it means that each individual mode is locked on the asymmetry vector, and the asymmetry vector is precessing. And this is what explains what we've just seen. We've just witnessed the precession of the asymmetry vector, and each individual mode was following this common precession. And you can see that the key parameters that will be important will be the Hamiltonian H0 plus Hlep evaluated at a given average momentum that is for small degeneracy parameters about pi. And even more importantly, you can see that the frequency of precession depends linearly, almost linearly in the chemical, the degeneracy parameters. So the smaller the degeneracy parameter, the smaller the frequency of precession. So at high temperatures, we expect every vector to be aligned along the z-axis, but then at some point, V of YF will undergo the MSW transition from the z-axis to H0. And so at that moment, A will become misaligned with D. So either this transition is adiabatic, so A will follow V and then no oscillations can take place, or this transition is really abrupt, and then there will be quite a wide angle between A and H0, and then we will observe some synchronous oscillations. So let's check that here. So in this first example, on the left plot, you will have in green the asymmetry for the new mu, and in red the asymmetry for the new tau. So if you take the difference between these two values, it gives you the vector A, and on the right plot, I have plotted the unit vectors A and VF. So this is a plot for a degeneracy of 0.1. And so, as I mentioned, in brown, you can see the MSW transition from lepton dominated to vacuum dominated. And A was quite following the Hamiltonian, but then there is a remaining angle between the two vectors, and you have this synchronous oscillation, which accelerates with time, because actually you can see here there is an x to the power 2 increasing of the frequency. So let's look now, if we reduce by 1 order of magnitude the degeneracy parameters, and you can see that the precession frequency is supposed to be much smaller, 10 times smaller. And now you can see that the Hamiltonian undergoes its MSW transition, but A doesn't manage to follow it. So now you have large synchronous oscillations, you have a large angle between the two vectors, and this is actually the case I showed before. So we are quite happy with the phenomenology. We sort of understand what's happening. So I decrease once again the degeneracy parameters. So the frequency will be even smaller. I'm now at 0.001. Once again, a very non-adiabatic transition. And A is starting quite slowly. It's starting to precess. So you can see on the right that it's precessing, and then it's going back. Instead of continuing to precessing, it's precessing the other way around. So this is a sort of new behavior that we were not expecting. If we have a simple precession equation, it shouldn't like go back and forth. And we can actually explain, I would call that a regime of quasi-synchronous oscillations. And this is due to the fact that up until now, I said that rho and rho bar were following J, the self-interaction Hamiltonian. But actually, remember the quantum kinetic equation, for rho, the full Hamiltonian under which we have to project it according to our ATAO prescription is J plus V, while for rho bar, it's J minus V. And when you expand, assuming that V is much smaller than J, you get this expression for the precession frequency. The first term being the leading order term that we were talking about up until now, and you get an extra contribution that is the next to leading order one. And you see that first you can have a possible cancellation of the two terms, and that's why we had that's what we observed, a cancellation. The frequency went to 0 and then went to the other way around. And moreover, when this term dominates, the frequency increases as x to the power 6. So you have a much faster, much higher frequency. And that's why we had before quite a small frequency, and then a much higher once the back and forth had taken place. We had a much higher frequency. So this is a new regime that was not seen before, and that we can understand thanks to this approximation. Now I will just briefly talk about the effect of collisions, because I would just want to highlight that in our calculation, we put the true collision term, I mean the one that comes from the quantum kinetic equations. So this collision term is almost transparent to nu mu nu tau oscillations, and this is due to the fact that nu mu and nu tau have the same interactions. So so that's for nu mu and nu tau, and for interactions with electrons, there are some charge current processes with electrons and positrons that are not present for the other flavors, and it means that there is the collision term does not allow, broadly speaking, does not allow synchronous oscillations which involve nu e. So this is an example of a two-flavor system with nu e and nu mu, and on the left you have no collisions, on the right you have collisions, and you can see that the synchronous oscillations are really like damped. They get destroyed by the collision term. And just to show that it's really important to put the real collision term, I compare here a work that was done in 2002 with a damping approximation. It's a three-flavor case, but basically you can see that as a nu mu nu tau two-flavor system. And on the right, we use the same parameters. And you can see that, as I said, the collision term allows for those synchronous oscillations in the nu mu nu tau subspace, while this damping approximation, we expect that it was overkilling the oscillations. So there is a difference of behavior that needs to be taken into account if you want to be really precise. And I will end up on this with the three-flavor framework. So this is just when you put the three flavors, you have a whole landscape that you can explore. So we'll just give a few highlights. First, you can see that as we reduce the chemical potentials, which is from the left to the right, we have indeed, for smaller chemical potential differences, we have less adiabatic transition, so we have larger sequence oscillations. You can see very well on the right when we go from the leading order to the next to leading order dominations, so the x squared to x to the power 6 frequency case. And one thing I'd like to mention is the fact that in the end, you do not necessarily have all the asymmetries that are equal. So it means that a full exploration of the parameter space is interesting to know, because that's a very common assumption whenever you want to derive some constraints. You assume that in the end, all flavors have the same degeneracy parameter, but actually not necessarily, not in full generality. And so we are starting to look at what can we really say that now that we have this full framework that is ready to, I would say, ready to work. Now we can start to really explore. So I said that. So just to conclude, I presented here this ATAO approximation that was previously used to derive in our previous paper this result and the new recommended value for the effective number of neutrinos, and we extended it to the case including primordial asymmetries. So it managed to recover standard results like the synchronous oscillations, but also uncover new behaviors. Well, I talked about the quasi-synchronous oscillations. I just want to highlight that using this, since we project the vector onto the Hamiltonian, we have to use less variables in our code. So it's a faster code, but still very accurate resolution. The full quantum kinetic equation results are indistinguishable from these approximate ones. The collision term, using its full form, is actually really important to capture the correct behavior. And I presented in the end very quickly the first hints of the full three-flavor calculation. And now we will have to explore the parameter space. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you for that fascinating talk. Let's have some questions from the audience. Who would like to go first? Perhaps I'll go first then. I guess I'd like to ask a very general question. What are the, well, you were saying you want to explore this parameter space for the various parameters that you have that are controlling all of the kind of complicated physics here. What would be the observable probes that we'd use to try and constrain them from cosmology? I mean, you got an effective there. Is there anything else? So
basically, yeah, we want to use the constraints from BBN and CMB, because if you look at, for instance, if you have degeneracy parameters, let's say chemical potential, they will affect the neutron for BBN. They will affect the neutron to proton ratio, because this ratio is set by reactions with the electronic neutrinos and antineutrinos. So if you have a chemical potential, it will change the equilibrium ratio between neutrons and protons. So you can have, for instance, much more neutrons or much less neutrons. So it will result in much more or much less helium-4. And since we have some constraints on the values of the helium abundance, we can derive constraints on the degeneracy parameters. Same goes for the effective number of neutrinos. And for that, we can use BPN as well and CMB. So yeah, the idea is to use the constraints from these, and thanks to our code, to bridge the gap between the initial degeneracies and those observables.
So the various sort of kind of complicated behaviors that you observe, are these the sorts of things that you'd be able to tell the difference between with existing data on say the wonders of helium, or is it the kind of thing you'd need the next generation of some cosmological probes to be able to sort of explore? explore this in more detail.
I'm not sure I understand, but you mean would we be precise enough to with the existing?
So I mean, depending on where you are in this parameter space, you have all of this different behavior that you observe. Are the various sort of these various kind of different behaviors the sorts of things which would give you observable differences to parameters at the current level, or do you need a next generation level to be able to
actually, I don't know yet. I expect that as usual we'll be saying that we need some next generation experiments in the end. But what I think might see one important thing would be that since we will be able to really observe cases where all the neutrinos do not share the same degeneracy in the end, we might end up having some regions of the parameter space where the degeneracy parameters are not the same, which are maybe more favored than others compared to previous studies where it's supposed to be the same. So we might have that even with the current data, because for instance in BBN only constraints, I mean the neutron to proton ratio part of BBN only constrained the NUI chemical potential. So that's, you have complementary probes, and we can hope that even with that current probes we can get some new interesting results. But for now I cannot tell you much more.
Archel.
Yeah, maybe I'll just briefly follow up. First of all, thank you for a very fascinating talk. It was very interesting and detailed. Yeah, so I think that that's the same question. What Kiran was asking. Are there any other kind of physics implication of this, different degeneracy? For example, would you expect something different for QCD phase transitions and things like that? Or it's that difference is too small compared to the theoretical uncertainties.
So for QCD phase transition, honestly, I do not know. But what we have to remember is that what we are looking at right now is actually a very particular case of very high neutrino degeneracy parameters, because first, when we have to remember that in the standard leptogenesis scenarios, etc., we expect the degeneracy to be of the order of the baryon-to-photon ratio, so it should be 10 to the -9. So we do not expect to have these necessarily all these behaviors, because they would be completely hidden. But otherwise, yeah, no, I don't have a definitive answer to give you.
Yeah, of course. At this point, we don't care about the origin of this. It can be a kind of initial condition or something, right? But the probe by itself is very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, and for the probe, to give what would give us information on these parameters, I only see what's coming after. So BBN, CMB.
Anyone else? One final thing I would like to ask about is, would the imprints of this sort of behavior be present in the cosmic neutrino background? Should that be observable at some point in the future?
So basically, that's interesting. How can I let me go back? Yes, to here. So the cosmic neutrino background is basically the distribution functions of these neutrinos in the end. And you can see, for instance, on the right plot, we expect if we're in a regime where we have synchronous oscillations, they will get faster and faster and faster, and it's becoming, for the numerical code, completely untrackable. So that's why we decided brutally at 2 megaelectron-volt to switch to an average over the Hamiltonian without the self-interactions. And you can see that it looks like we are taking the good average. So it looks okay. But you expect collisions to tend to go to that limit. But basically, we expect the thing is, we expect at some point these oscillations to get averaged. So the average of the values of the oscillations should have an imprint on the cosmic neutrino background. But actually, the whole the whole past of oscillations will lead potentially to a different final value for the average. So that's why it's important to follow it as long as we can, because then otherwise, that's what I meant with the left plot, when the dashed lines, which are taken without taking into account the mean field self-interactions, are different from the solid lines. And since it's different, you expect, look at the blue lines, for instance, you expect some errors on your cosmic neutrino background predictions. But I mean, anyway, for now, it's let's first detect it, and then we'll try for the primordial asymmetries. But yeah.
Great. Okay, I'll stop.